Well, good evening. We're going to almost finish up tonight. We're going to do the next to the last lesson in Colossians. After next week, we will have looked at every single verse in Colossians. And I think that's a really good thing, to do a really deep study of every single verse like this. Let's kind of back up, though, and look at where we came from. In the last two chapters of Colossians here, so in 3 and 4, Paul is telling the Colossians, he exhorts them to live the kind of life that demonstrates their faith in Jesus Christ as all-sufficient or preeminent. And so that means that we're supposed to put Jesus in the number one spot in our life, and there's nothing else beside him. So if we look at the first half of chapter 3, he describes the basics of Christian living. And then in the second half of chapter 3, he's going to describe the Christian's clothing. We need to put on Christ, right? And then in the last half of the last few verses of chapter 3 and the first verse of chapter 4, he's talking about family matters. We talked about that last time, about how wives are supposed to act, about how husbands are supposed to act, how children, how employers or masters are supposed to act, how slaves are supposed to act, or employees. And so prior to making his final comments for the book, he's now going to give at least 3 main exhortations, things that he wants to build them up in to these brethren at Colossae. And I'm going to call them in this lesson Paul's charge. This lesson is all about the essentials, kind of, to living the Christ-like life. He's charging them, you need to do these things to live a Christ-like life. So, in first couple verses there, verses 2 through 4 of chapter 4, Paul wants them to continue in prayer. He wants them to have a prayer that's faithful. He's writing that they continue earnestly in prayer. Depends on what version you have as to what that says there. Mine says, devote yourselves to prayer. I think the New King James says, continue earnestly in prayer. So it's very similar to what he wrote to the Romans. In Romans chapter 12, there at the end of Romans. Hold on, let me get my bookmark going here. I'm going to be flipping back and forth. Romans and Colossians and Ephesians, because Ephesians is so very similar. Romans chapter 12 and verse 12 says, rejoicing in hope, persevering in tribulation, devoted to prayer. And he said the same thing to the Thessalonians in 1 Thessalonians chapter 5 in verse 17. He says, pray without ceasing. So this is like a pretty common theme through all of Paul's letters here, that he tells them that they need to continue in prayer, and that people faithfully continue in prayer. The fact that people should continue to faithfully pray was a subject that Jesus taught about also. He taught a parable that men should always pray in Luke chapter 18, the first part of Luke there, in 18 verse 1. He was concerned that when he returned, he might not find faith on the earth. And so if we look at Luke chapter 18 and verse 1, it says, now he was telling them a parable to show them that at all times they ought to pray and not lose heart, saying, there was in a certain city a judge who did not fear God and did not respect man. And there was a widow in that city, and she kept coming to him saying, give me legal protection from my opponent." And for a while he was unwilling, but afterward he said to himself, "Even though I do not fear God or respect man, yet because this widow bothers me, I will give her legal protection, lest by continually coming she wear me out." And the Lord said, "Hear what this unrighteous judge said. Now shall not God bring about justice for his elect, who cry out to him day and night, and will he delay long over them? I tell you that he will bring about justice for them speedily. However, when the Son of Man comes, will he find faith on the earth?" There's a question there. He was concerned that he wasn't even going to find faith on the earth when he came back. And I think there's other role models that we can have in the Bible. We have David, a man after God's own heart. Half the Psalms or more, well, all the Psalms pretty much are prayers to God. Went a little too far there in my notes. Daniel, a man who was greatly loved by God in Daniel 6 and verse 10. Anna, elderly widow, blessed to see the child of Christ. And of course, Paul himself had his prayers answered. Epaphras, the person this letter of Colossians was going to be carried back to the city and possibly started the church there in Colossae, was a man who prayed quite a bit. We see that in chapter 4 and verse 12 of Colossians. It says, "Epaphras, who is one of your number, a bondslave of Jesus Christ, sends you his greetings, always laboring earnestly for you in his prayers, that you might stand perfect and fully assured in the will of God." So the prayer needs to be watchful, or as Paul put it in our context, we need to be vigilant in it. On several occasions, Jesus warned his disciples to be watchful in prayer. In Mark chapter 13 and Matthew 26, when we were talking about, even in this song we sang before the Lord's Supper there, in "'Tis Midnight on Olive's Brow," says, "Even the apostle that Christ loved left him." And so Christ had specifically warned them to be vigilant and to stay up and keep guard of themselves and to pray, but they fell asleep because they got tired. And so that's a metaphor for us. We don't need to fall asleep in our lives. Sometimes we think we're doing pretty good. We got a job, we got a house, we can keep on kind of cruising, right? We fall asleep at the wheel and forget about how important prayer is in our life. And Paul warns us, Peter warns us, and I think that it's through watchful praying that we won't be caught unprepared for those things that prayer is supposed to help protect us from. We won't be caught unprepared when Satan tempts us with sin. We won't be unprepared for death and the judgment that follows death. We won't be unprepared for Christ and when he returns and the glories that are ready for us and for him when he comes again. So we need to be faithful or vigilant in our prayer. We need to be watchful. We need to be thankful. Always praying with thanksgiving, Paul says. And throughout the epistle of the Colossians, or the letter to the Colossians, it's a running theme. Chapter 1, verse 3, verse 12, chapter 2, verse 7, chapter 3, verse 15, 17, chapter 4, verse 2. This is something that they're supposed to be doing quite a bit of, to be thankful, and specifically thankful to God. And someone said that we should thank God just as diligently in our prayers as we make requests from him, right? So we need to make sure we abound with thanksgiving. And the last point I'd make about how our prayers need to be is that our prayer needs to be fruitful. Fruitful, what does that mean? It needs to bear fruit. It needs to have an object or objective for it. So Paul requested of the brethren there at Colossae that they needed to pray for him also, not just for themselves. Sometimes our prayers are often really general, Lord, help your children around the world, those types of things. And they kind of lack a specific purpose. But here in our text, I think Paul is asking or telling them to ask for specific prayers on his behalf. And he does that again in Romans chapter 15 and verses 30, if you want to read that. Specific requests what specific requests, let me make it a question. What specific requests can we make for those who preach and teach the word? For me, what requests do you have for me to ask in my prayers, and what requests do I have for you to pray about me? Well, what about an open door into the community to tell other people about Christ? We find that in verse 3 there of chapter 4. It says, praying at the same time for us as well, that God may open to us a door for the word. Open door. We need to pray for wisdom as we ought to speak there in verse 4. We need to pray for boldness in Ephesians chapter 6 and verse 20, or 19 and 20. So as we endeavor, as we try really hard to live that Christ-like life, we need to make the right kind of prayer. We need to make the right kind of prayer a crucial element. We need a prayer that is faithful and watchful and thankful and fruitful. We need to pray for ourselves, and we need to pray for those that are other people also that are doing the work. So if we look at verse 5, there's a special charge there. There's a special exhortation there. And he says, conduct yourselves with wisdom towards outsiders, making the most of the opportunity. And I think this exhortation here is also crucial for living that Christ-like life. We need to continue in prayer, especially when we're among those people that are not Christians. We need to walk in wisdom, or make the most, conduct yourself with wisdom towards outsiders, making the most of the opportunity. I've already done a lesson over this verse. I don't know if you remember the lesson that had the picture of the Opportunity rover and with the background of Mars on it. And I made the analogy that rover is like 10 years past its lifespan. It's making the most of its own name, Opportunity. And it just recently, actually just a few months ago, died. And so it finally caved. But it was only supposed to last like 90 days, this rover. And so it took its opportunity. The idea is that it took its opportunity, if we personify it, and it made the most of its opportunity. And so we need to do the same thing. We need to make the most of our opportunity, and we need to do it wisely. Now, that word opportunity, or making the most of the opportunity, that's the way it's translated in my Bible, in the King James, and in the New King James, and in the ESV, it says redeeming the time. Redeeming the time. Redeeming is that word, and we talked about it before. It's like at a pawn shop or at layaway at Walmart or something. You go and you have to redeem the object. You have to buy it back. The object, you got it off the shelf. You had it in your hands, but you gave it away to somebody, or the object was taken away from you, and now you have to go buy it back. And that's literally what the Greek word means. It means to purchase for something. And so to purchase for what? To purchase for time. But what does that mean? Well, let's look at it. So we need to be concerned about how we walk because we don't have a lot of time left. We need to redeem that time. We need to make the most of that time. So in other words, it's how we conduct ourselves. We're to walk in wisdom, especially towards those people that are outside of Christ. And so by our own proper conduct, we can influence people and influence them for good. And the world is constantly making judgments against us based on our conduct. Now, most often you'll hear from the world that we are judging them, but the same thing is happening from them to us. They are making judgments on us and trying to put us in the little peg hole of where we belong in their mind. And according to Jesus, this is kind of their privilege. That's how it's the system is set up. When they see us doing good things, they put us in the good things category. And that's why it's important that we conduct ourselves in a appropriate manner, whatever that situation is. Another reason is because of time that we talked about already, or to be more accurate, or to get to the point, the lack of time, right? We don't have forever on this earth. Our time that we have in this life is short, and we can't afford to waste much of it through foolishness or sin. And there's some people who need Christ, whose time that is left on the earth is even shorter than ours. We may not know it. They might even be younger than us. So we need to redeem the time. We need to make the most of the time that we have. So as we consider, as we look at these essentials kind of to living that Christ-like life, as we look at Paul's charge for us today and the Colossians then, let's remember that it was said of Jesus that people marveled at his gracious words that proceeded out of his mouth. So we need to remember that as his disciples, that we also need to speak with grace. There in verse 6. It says, "Let your speech always be with grace, seasoned, as it were, with salt, so that you may know how you should respond to each person." So the power of our tongue, there's a saying that the pen is mightier than the sword. Well, the tongue is at least as mighty as the pen, if not more, because it's more persuasive. It's more, what's the word I'm looking for? It's more of an emotional, it causes more of an emotional response in us. Because it affects the entire body. The tongue does. Let's look at James chapter 3. It says in verse 2, "For we all stumble in many ways. If anyone does not stumble in what he says, he is a perfect man, able to bridle the whole body as well." The tongue is like a rudder that steers the ship. And he uses that same analogy here in James chapter 3. It can have great destructive power, like in verse 6. "And the tongue is a fire, the very world of iniquity. The tongue is set among our members as that which defiles the entire body and sets on fire the course of our life and is set on fire by hell." That's a powerful statement. The tongue destroys our life if we don't bridle it, like James said. Bridle is that metal piece, usually, sometimes bone, would have been bone in these days probably. Oh, they might have had metal bridles by this time, that they would have put in the horses, around the horse's head, and then tied that to a bit that controlled the horse, and it presses down on their tongue. And so it's inconsistent for us to use it for both good and evil. And so we need a plan to speak with grace then. How do we make that plan? I've skipped over a lot of the Ephesians references just for time tonight, because I didn't want this lesson to go on forever, because we've already covered a lot of these references. But Ephesians chapter 5 is, and 5 and 6 are very similar to the letter to the Colossians. So Ephesians chapter 5 and verse 29 says, "For no one has ever hated his own flesh, but nourishes it and cherishes it, just as Christ also does with the church." So we need to learn to speak with grace. We need to learn how to control and nourish and cause ourselves to grow with our speech and not tear ourselves down like James says that the tongue can do. We need to not let any corrupt communication proceed out of our mouths. I didn't write down the verse for that, but I forgot which one that is. We need to only have things that come out of our mind, our mouth, that edify people, that builds them up, that educates them. We need to impart to the hearers of the word, we need to impart grace. That is God's gift to them. We need to tell them about that. Our speech is supposed to be seasoned with salt. And that's, of course, not to be confused with salty language, of various sailors and fishermen around this town. Our speech is supposed to be seasoned with salt, not salty language. But rather, it needs to be properly flavored so that it will be well received by others. And we especially need to watch our language around people who are not Christians, so that we can know how to answer each one. As a servant of the Lord must not quarrel. And those are two different quotes. One's from verse 6 here, and then the second half of that, a servant of the Lord must not quarrel, is from 2 Timothy chapter 2 and verse 23. But the important part there is that we need to especially watch our words when we're around people that aren't Christians, because we need to be giving off a good impression of what a Christian is, because they're going to put other people in that same category that they put you. And if you're cursing like a sailor, oh, well, he doesn't actually do what he says, therefore all Christians don't really do what they say, and it looks poorly on other people as well. We need to be careful of our own speech, because I mean, how do we expect others to live up to some standard when we're not even living it in our own lives? So, do we claim to be disciples of Christ and speak the words of truth that come by Him in the same gracious manner or same gracious way that He spoke them? That's the question. That's the idea for us tonight. Do we speak with grace? So to kind of tie everything together, there's three main ideas here about that Paul is trying to get across to us kind of as a final charge in his letter here. And that if we will truly take them to heart, we can have a powerful impact. It will have a powerful impact on our lives. Our prayer life will be very different. Our walk, our daily walk, our conduct will be noted. It will be visible in that it's wise. It will be noted for its wisdom. Our speech will be a source of encouragement to other people. So this really is the essence of following Christ. To allow Him to also live in us that by God's grace, we experience a transformation that affects every aspect of our life. Through the gift He's given us of salvation, of unmerited favor, if we will allow Him to transform our lives, it's going to have a very large impact on our lives. And it's going to, or let me just say, it'll impact every area of your life. And so speaking of the grace of God, well, let me back up. It affects every aspect of our lives. So since we're talking about the grace of God, have you taken advantage of His grace, of that unmerited favor? Have you had your sins washed away? Let's look again in Romans chapter 5. He says in verse 8, he says, "But God demonstrates His own love toward us." That is the definition of grace. That unmerited favor, that gift, that demonstration of love is the definition of grace. But God demonstrated His own love towards us in that while we were yet sinners, Christ died for us. Have you taken advantage of that gift? He goes on to tell us in chapter 6 how we do that. The question is, what time is it for you? Have you redeemed the time? Have you made the most of the time? Have you done everything Christ has commanded you? He says, "Or do you not know that all of us who have been baptized into Christ have been baptized into His death? Therefore we have been buried with Him through baptism into death, in order that as Christ was raised from the dead through the glory of the Father, so we too might walk in newness of life." You can't walk in the newness of life until you kill the old person and bury them in the waters of baptism. He goes on to say in verse 7, "For he who has died is free from sin." You are not free from your sin until you bury that old man of sin in the waters of baptism. If you need to be baptized, or if you need the prayers of the congregation, if we need to pray for you, like Paul says here in Colossians, praying unceasingly, or devoting yourselves to prayer. If you need the prayers of the congregation, or you need baptism, or whatever it happens to be, please let us know. And let's all stand and sing the song that's been selected.